One of the most common questions and requests that I get is to share the specific camera settings that I use for each one of my photos that I share online. People want to know what f-stop I'm using, shutter speed, ISO, because they think by having the exact information it will help them with their own photography. Although I share this information in my zines, personally I don't think having specific camera settings is actually that useful. What is more useful is a holistic and a high-level bird's eye view approach to camera settings, specifically grouping them together. And also a quick thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, but more on them later. Let me start with a disclaimer. If your style of photography involves taking your time, setting up a tripod, dialing everything in, and taking a photo of a very still landscape or cityscape, then this video might not be for you because you have the luxury of time to dial in your settings. However, if you're like me and you're running around the city with your camera in your hand, taking photos, then you might not have the time to get the correct settings, because by the time you've got your correct settings, whatever fleeting moment that you saw is probably gone. Finally, everything I'm sharing is just my personal opinion based on my experience and based on what works for me and how I understand camera settings. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's just my viewpoint. Oh, and very quickly, in case someone has noticed it, you'll probably see my neck is not 100% straight. Those of you who've been watching the channel for a while know I've got 2 slip discs in my neck, and whenever they flare up because I've been sitting badly or I've done something to my neck, it goes into a spasm. So on today, this side is spasming a little bit more, which kind of pulls it over. So after this video, I'm going to go back to the physio and get it kind of put back. Okay, so personally, I think sharing camera settings is not very beneficial for these three reasons. The first one is you don't know my thought process at the time of me taking a photo. So you'll see a nice photo taken at midday, but then you'll wonder to yourself, hold on, why are you using ISO 1000? Well, the reason I could be using ISO 1000 is because there's a car coming. I want to make sure it's fairly frozen, however, still maintain good amount of in focus things. Therefore, I'm shooting at, I don't know, f11 and at a shutter speed of 1/1000. Secondly, you don't know how much editing and post-processing I've done to the photo. So you could see a well-exposed photo. However, in reality, that photo could have been underexposed to preserve the highlights and then boosted later in Lightroom. So I would have used settings to get an underexposed photo to then bring it back up later. So you could look at 2 images from the same place, one's perfectly exposed, one's underexposed, and at the end, after editing, they can look identical, but you have 2 very different sets of settings. And finally, you just don't know the condition that's there in real life at the time of taking a photo. Many times I've taken a photo which looks very bright, however in real life it was actually quite dark, and I had to increase the brightness using either the settings on the camera or in editing. So you see, just by looking at a photo and a set of settings alone without any context, you might be struggling to understand why certain settings could have been used. However, I think there's a slightly better approach to understanding camera settings, and not just from a viewer's perspective, but also from a photographer's perspective. And to do that, we place camera settings into specific groups. Let's start with ISO, and the first group is from base ISO, let's say 160, up until around ISO 1000. This is going to be your daytime or your good lighting group. Also, you know that anywhere within that range, the noise will be to a minimum. I don't think you'll see a huge difference between ISO 200 and 500. I mean, if you really pixel peep to 5000% and do all that kind of stuff, maybe, but for most normal people, you will not see any difference. Group number 2 will be anywhere between 1000 and ISO 3200. You'll probably use this when the light is just not great. It could be dusk or dawn, it could be like a really heavily overcast day, or it just could be somewhere indoors where you need a bit more ISO. Now, noise will start to creep in, however, it's not going to be a deal breaker. And you know, as long as you roughly stay within that range, you'll have a very workable image and, you know, very minimal noise. So worrying whether you need to shoot at ISO 2000 or 2500, it's not going to make any real difference. The final group is anywhere between 3200 and 6400, and this is what I will use, let's say, later on at night when it's quite dark. Obviously, noise now is becoming a bit of an issue and something that you need to deal with, especially on APS-C cameras. However, I wouldn't necessarily stress over using ISO 5000 or 6400 because at that level, the noise will be very similar and it will require some work to remove. Now let's talk about shutter speed. A very quick disclaimer, as most of you would know, the shutter speed will depend on what lens you use. So the longer the lens, the higher the shutter speed across the board has to be, and that's because with a longer lens, obviously, any movement is exaggerated. Now for the purpose of this video, let's just say 35mm full frame, which is a pretty common focal length that most of us would use. So the first group will use a shutter speed of between 1/30 and 1/100. Whenever you're in this group, you're typically dealing with a lower light situation or when you'd want to get motion blur. And in this particular range, you know that you need to be very careful in terms of camera movements. Now, I've done a nighttime photography video where I share a few tips to get the camera a bit more stable. Also, if you have things like IBIS or lens stabilization, you might want to switch them on. And generally, you need to be aware that when you are within this particular range, you have to be careful and you should expect a degree of motion blur from any moving subject in your frame. However, should you agonize over shooting at 1/50 or 1/70? Probably not, because it's not really going to make any difference. Group 2 is 1/160 to 1/250. Now you have a bit more breathing room here because of a higher shutter speed. However, you still have to be careful. You still don't want to be rushing around and you want to stop before taking a photo. Furthermore, faster moving subjects within your frame, such as cars, will still have a degree of motion blur, which is something that you need to keep in mind. Again, are you going to see a huge difference between 1/200 and 1/220? No, you're not. And the final group is 1/500 and above. The reason I say and above is because realistically, for most of us, if you shoot at 1/500 and then at 1/5000, you're going to see zero difference in your photos. Now, obviously there are exceptions. If you are a Formula 1 photographer, a wildlife photographer, or anything of that nature, that pun was slightly intended, then obviously a higher shutter speed of 1/3000 will probably give you a different result to 1/500. But as I've said, for most of us, it's not really going to make any real difference. And finally, we have aperture. Now, this can be actually categorized into 4 different groups. The first group I would like to call wide open, so anything between f1.4 and f2.8. This is what I would select in low light conditions when I want the maximum amount of background blur or when I want the softest possible image, because lenses tend to be the softest when they are wide open. Now, am I going to stress if I shoot at f2 instead of f1.4? Not really. The second group is that mid-range, at least for me, between f2.8 and f5.6, specifically around f4 is where I tend to sit a lot. However, honestly, anywhere between that range is going to be absolutely fine. So for me, it's a nice mid-ground because you get a really nice balance between what's out of focus, what's in focus. So you have some separation, but it's not too much. Also, the lenses tend to be a bit sharper at that focal length. And finally, it's a good amount of light coming in with ample opportunity to quickly adjust it one way or the other. But am I going to stress over shooting f4 versus f5.6? Not really. Are you going to see a clear difference in your image between these two? Not really. So again, keep it within that range, but I wouldn't necessarily stress over which one in particular to use. The third group is anywhere between f8 and f11, so many street photographers and landscape photographers would comfortably sit somewhere here. You are getting the most sort of depth of field with, so the least difference between what's in focus, what's out of focus. However, going between f9 and f8 is not really gonna give you any tangible results. If you're gonna look at a photo that's been shot at f8 and a photo that's been shot at f10, for example, you're not going to sit there and go, oh my god, the f10 photo, they've ruined it, they should have been f8. It just doesn't work like that. But as long as it's in that range, you're good. And finally, there's everything above f11, can be f14, f16, even f22. I generally avoid that whole area because you start to get diffraction. Autofocus systems can start to slow down at those higher apertures. So generally, I'll only keep them for absolute emergencies if there's just so much light coming in that I can't control. But generally, I'd avoid them. At this point, I would like to thank the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. Squarespace is my main portfolio where people come to see my best work. I have full control of how my work is presented and interacted with. Squarespace is also the hub for my business, my newsletter, and my travel photography blog. Finally, I use Squarespace as my social media landing page and my digital business card. Whether you're a beginner or a pro, having your own website is never a bad idea. So if this is something that interests you, click the link below to get a free trial followed by 10% off your first purchase. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring, and thank you for watching. So from now on, whenever you look at camera settings, look at them in these groups and don't look at them as individual settings. Don't stress about going between 1/200 and 1/220. Just be aware that, okay, I am in this kind of lower mid group, therefore I need to be a bit more careful, but I still can get enough in focus without having a motion blur. Equally with ISO, if you're at ISO 2000, don't be trying to get down to ISO 1800 because you'll think you'll save the image, because in reality it's not going to make any real difference. And finally, with aperture, if you're trying to decide between f8 and f9, stop trying to decide and take the photo, because by the time you've decided, you probably would have missed the opportunity. Okay, that's about everything. Before I leave you, I want to ask you the question, what do you think of this system? Does it make sense to you? Does it not make sense to you? Have you used something similar yourself? And how do you approach about looking at camera settings? Do you group them together, or do you look at them on an individual basis? So that's it. Nothing else to say. I want to wish you a very good week. I'm waffling. Thank you, and see you later. Bye.